I've lived long enough to see how life turns on small choices. A word spoken, a hand offered, a stranger who stays when they had every reason to leave. Most folks spend their whole lives looking for belonging in the wrong places, never knowing it might be standing right in front of them at a train station on an ordinary morning. I saw it happen once. In a dusty town out west, the train whistle screamed across the platform. A man stood at the edge of the boarding area, mud caked on his boots, his shirt wrinkled like he'd slept in it for days. He wasn't waiting for the train. He was watching the woman sitting alone on the bench, a worn leather bag at her feet, a ticket clutched in her hands. "Ma'am," his voice came out rough, tired. "You looking for work?" She didn't answer. Her fingers tightened around that ticket to California. "I got 2 boys," he said. 7 years old, twins. Their mama's been gone near a year now. He paused, swallowed hard. "They don't talk no more. Not a word. Not to me. Not to nobody." The train doors opened behind her. People pushed past. She didn't move. If you're listening tonight from a quiet place, a porch, a kitchen, wherever life has brought you, I'd love to know where you're watching from. And if these stories have kept you company, but you haven't yet subscribed, we'd be grateful to have you join us. The wagon rattled over dried ruts in the road. Margaret gripped the wooden seat, her knuckles white against the splintered grain. Daniel Carter hadn't spoken since they left the station. His jaw stayed set, his eyes fixed ahead, his hands steady on the reins. The land opened up around them, brown grass stretching toward blue mountains, scattered cottonwoods casting thin shadows across the dirt. No houses, no neighbors, just emptiness and sky. The ranch appeared after nearly an hour. A cabin, small, 1 story, weathered boards the color of old bones, a barn listing slightly to the left, fence posts that needed mending, a water pump rusted at the handle. And on the porch, 2 boys, identical, dark hair, dark eyes, sitting side by side on the top step like they'd been carved from the same piece of wood. Daniel pulled the wagon to a stop. Dust settled around the wheels. "Boys," he called out. "Come say hello." Neither moved. Margaret climbed down, her boots hitting hard-packed dirt. She smoothed her skirt gray, faded, the hem frayed from too many washings, and walked toward the porch. The boys watched her. No, not watched. Observed. The way animals observe strangers entering their territory. "I'm Margaret," she said. Nothing. The one on the left, Ethan, she would learn later, shifted his gaze to his father, then back to her. His brother didn't blink. In his lap, half hidden by his small hands, sat a wooden horse, roughly carved, the mane uneven. One ear slightly larger than the other, handmade. Margaret crouched down to their level. The smaller one, Elijah, pulled the horse closer to his chest. "That's a fine horse you got there," she said softly. His fingers tightened. His eyes dropped to the porch boards. Behind her, Daniel's boots scraped the dirt. She heard him exhale a sound like something deflating. "Come on inside," he said. "I'll show you where you'll sleep." Margaret straightened. The boys hadn't moved, hadn't spoken, hadn't done anything but breathe and stare and hold on to whatever small thing they could still control. She followed Daniel toward the door. And then she heard it. Behind her. So quiet she almost missed it. A small, shuddering breath. The kind that comes after crying too long with no one listening. She stopped. Her hand froze on the door frame. Which boy had made that sound? The barn smelled of old hay and horse sweat. Margaret lay on a pile of straw in the corner, a thin wool blanket pulled up to her chin. Moonlight sliced through gaps in the wooden slats, painting silver lines across the dirt floor. She couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the train pulling away from the station. The ticket to California still sat in her bag, tucked between her spare dress and a photograph she hadn't looked at in months. Thomas, her husband, dead 14 months now, crushed beneath an overturned wagon on a road outside Lawrence. She turned onto her side. The straw crackled beneath her weight. This wasn't her life. This wasn't her family. She had agreed to 3 months. 3 months of cooking and cleaning and watching 2 silent boys who looked through her like she was made of glass. Then California. Then something new. Something that didn't smell like grief and old wood and other people's memories. A rooster crowed somewhere in the distance. Too early. The sky outside the barn door showed no light yet, just black. Endless black. Pricked with stars she didn't recognize. Margaret sat up. Her bones ached from the hard ground. She pulled on her boots, laced them tight, and stepped outside. The cold hit her first. Sharp. Clean. The kind of cold that made her lungs burn with each breath. Dew clung to the grass, soaking through her stockings where her boots didn't reach. The mountains stood as dark shapes against a darker horizon, silent and watching. And then she saw him, Elijah, the smaller twin, sitting on the top step of the porch, knees pulled to his chest. The wooden horse clutched in both hands. Margaret stopped walking. Her boots scraped against a rock. And the boy's head turned. His eyes found hers across the darkness. He didn't move. Didn't run. Just watched. She walked toward the porch slowly. Each step deliberate. Her shadow stretched long behind her as she moved through the moonlight. The boards creaked when she reached the bottom step. Elijah's shoulders tensed. Margaret didn't speak, didn't ask why he was awake or tell him to go back inside. She simply lowered herself onto the step 2 feet away from him and looked east. The sky began to change. Black bled into gray. Gray softened into something almost blue. The stars faded one by one, like candles being snuffed out by an invisible hand. Neither of them spoke. A bird called from somewhere behind the barn. Another answered. The world woke up around them in small sounds, rustling grass, creaking wood, the distant lowing of cattle in the field. Margaret's hands rested on her knees. She could feel the boy's presence beside her. Small and rigid and watchful. She didn't look at him. Didn't try to force anything. Just sat there, breathing the same air, watching the same sky. The minutes stretched. Maybe 10, maybe 30. Time moved differently out here, away from train schedules and town clocks and the relentless forward march of civilized life. The cold seeped through her dress, but she didn't move to warm herself. Movement might break whatever fragile thing was forming in the silence between them. The sun crept above the horizon. Orange light spilled across the grassland. catching the dew on fence posts and turning each droplet into a tiny flame. The mountains shifted from black to purple to rose. Margaret watched the colors change and felt something loosen in her chest, something she hadn't known was tight. Movement beside her. Margaret held still. Elijah stood. His bare feet made no sound on the wooden planks. He stepped closer, close enough that she could see the dirt under his fingernails, the pale skin of his arms, covered in goosebumps from the cold, close enough that she could smell the hay in his hair, the soap from his last bath days ago. He held out the wooden horse. Margaret's breath caught. She didn't reach for it, didn't move at all. The horse hovered between them, offered on small palms that trembled slightly in the morning air. She waited. Elijah placed the horse on her lap. The wood felt warm from his hands. She could see the carving now, each strand of the mane cut with a small knife, the curve of the neck, the ears pointing forward as if listening. One ear slightly larger than the other. Handmade. Imperfect. The work of someone who had loved the boy enough to spend hours shaping this small thing. His mother's hands had made this. Margaret didn't touch it. Let it rest there on her gray skirt, heavy with meaning she couldn't name. Elijah looked at her. His eyes met hers. Dark brown, almost black in the early light. Not empty anymore. Something flickered there, something raw and wounded and desperately hoping. She had seen that look before. In her own mirror, in the months after Thomas died, when she still believed someone might come and make the pain stop. The boy reached down and took the horse back. His small fingers closed around it, and he turned toward the door. His hand touched the handle. He paused, looked back at her over his shoulder. 1 second, 2. Then he slipped inside, and the door clicked shut behind him. Margaret sat alone on the porch step. Her hands lay in her lap where the horse had been. The sun climbed higher, warming her face. But a tremor ran through her fingers that had nothing to do with the cold. Behind her, inside the cabin, footsteps moved across the floor, heavy. Daniel's boots on the wooden boards. The front door opened. He stood in the doorway, a tin cup in his hand. Steam rose from the coffee. His hair stuck up on one side, pillow flattened. His eyes were red-rimmed, the eyes of a man who measured sleep in minutes, not hours. "You're up early," he said. Margaret didn't turn around. Couldn't sleep. Daniel stepped onto the porch. His boots echoed on the boards. He moved to the post and leaned against it, looking out at the sunrise she had just watched with his son. "I saw you," he said quietly. "Through the window. You and Eli." She said nothing. "He put the horse in your lap." Still nothing. Daniel raised the cup to his lips, lowered it without drinking. The steam curled up between them and vanished in the morning air. "He don't let nobody touch that horse. Not me. Not Ethan. Not the doc who came to check on them after the funeral." His voice cracked on the last word. He cleared his throat. Hard. "Nobody." Margaret finally turned. She looked up at him at the lines around his eyes, the stubble on his jaw, the way his knuckles had gone white around that cup. "She made it for him," Daniel said. "Sarah, week before she took sick, said it was going to be his birthday present." He stared at the horizon, but his eyes saw something else, something gone. He turned 7 3 days after we buried her. Margaret stood. Her legs felt unsteady. She walked past him, into the cabin, toward the kitchen where the stove still held warmth from last night's fire. She found a second cup on the shelf, poured coffee from the pot. Her hand shook as she lifted it to her lips. Behind her, Daniel's voice came soft and strained. "Miss Margaret." She stopped. "Whatever you did out there, don't stop doing it." She didn't answer. Couldn't. Because standing in that kitchen, surrounded by another woman's pots and another woman's curtains and another woman's life, Margaret realized something that made her chest tight. She wasn't going to California. 3 weeks had changed the rhythm of the house. Margaret stood at the kitchen counter, flour dusted across her forearms, her hands deep in a bowl of dough. The afternoon sun slanted through the window, catching the white powder suspended in the air like tiny stars. Outside, she could hear Daniel hammering at something near the barn steady, rhythmic blows that had become part of the background noise of this place. She had learned the kitchen by touch and memory. The flour barrel stood by the back door. The salt lived in a tin box above the stove. The rolling pin had cracked years ago, so she used a glass bottle instead, the way her mother had taught her when she was a girl in Kansas. The motions came back to her hands without thinking. Fold, press, turn, fold, press, turn, movement at the doorway. Margaret didn't look up. She had noticed Ethan 5 minutes ago, his shadow falling across the threshold, but she had learned not to acknowledge him directly. With these boys, you didn't chase. You waited. Her hands worked the dough. The smell of butter and flour filled the kitchen. Mixing with the wood smoke from the stove, a fly buzzed against the window glass, trying to escape. "You can come closer if you want," she said, keeping her eyes on her work. "I ain't gonna bite." No response. But she heard his bare feet on the wooden floor. 3 steps. Then nothing. She glanced over her shoulder. Ethan stood by the table now, his hands at his sides, watching her fingers move through the dough. His dark eyes tracked every motion. "Your mama ever make pie?" A flicker crossed his face there and gone, quick as a fish beneath the surface of a pond. He nodded. Margaret's chest tightened. She turned back to the dough, giving him space, giving him time. "What kind?" The silence stretched. She kept working, not pushing, not expecting an answer. The dough grew smooth beneath her palms. She reached for the bottle, began to roll it flat, roll it. The table creaked. A chair scraped against the floor. She didn't turn around, but she heard him sit, heard the wood settle under his small weight, heard him breathing, slow and steady, watching her work. The pie went into the oven an hour before sunset. Margaret wiped her hands on her apron and walked out to the porch. The heat from the kitchen clung to her dress, and the cooler air outside felt good against her skin. Daniel was still working mending the fence now, his shirt dark with sweat despite the cooling air. Elijah sat on the top step, the wooden horse in his lap, watching his father drive posts into the hard ground. Supper that night was quieter than usual, but not silent. Not the dead, heavy silence of those first days. The beans steamed in their bowls. The cornbread sat golden on a plate. The pie cooled on the counter, filling the room with the smell of cooked apples and cinnamon. Margaret had found dried apples in the cellar preserved from last year's harvest, stored in jars with enough sugar to keep them through the winter. She had soaked them overnight and added what spices she could find. The four of them sat around the table. Daniel said grace short. Simple. The same words every night. The boys picked up their forks. Ethan ate slowly. His eyes kept moving to Margaret, to the pie on the counter, back to his plate. She pretended not to notice. Cut her ham into small pieces. Chewed. Swallowed. When the plates were nearly empty, Margaret stood and retrieved the pie. She cut 4 slices, placed them on tin plates, and set them around the table. Steam rose from each piece. Elijah picked up his fork immediately. Ethan stared at his plate. Then he took a bite, chewed, swallowed. His face changed. Not much, just a slight softening around the eyes, a loosening of his jaw. But Margaret saw it. Daniel saw it too. His own fork stopped halfway to his mouth. Ethan finished his slice in 6 bites. He set down his fork, looked at his empty plate, then he picked it up and held it out toward Margaret. No words, no sound, just his small hands extending the plate across the table, his eyes fixed on hers. Margaret's throat closed. She couldn't move. Daniel's chair scraped back. He stood, walked to the window, and stared out at the darkness. His shoulders shook once, twice. Margaret took the plate from Ethan's hands. Her fingers trembled as she cut another slice. The boy pulled it close and began to eat. Elijah watched his brother. Then, slowly, he pushed his own empty plate forward. Sunday morning came bright and clear. Margaret wore her best dress, still the gray one, faded from too many washings, but she had pressed it with a hot iron and mended the tear at the hem. Her hair was pinned up tight. The church sat at the edge of town, a small white building with a steeple that leaned slightly to the east. Wagons and horses crowded the yard. Families in their Sunday clothes walked toward the open doors. Daniel helped the boys down from the wagon. They stood stiffly in their clean shirts and suspenders, hair slicked down with water, still silent, still watchful. But Ethan stood closer to Margaret than he had 3 weeks ago, close enough that his shoulder almost touched her skirt. The whispers started before they reached the door. That's her, the woman living in his house. Ain't proper. Is it a widow man with a strange woman under his roof? Where'd she come from? Nobody knows nothing about her. Margaret kept her eyes forward, her spine straight. She had survived worse than whispers. She had buried a husband. She had sold everything she owned. She had gotten on a train with nothing but a bag and a photograph and a ticket to somewhere else. Whispers couldn't touch her. Inside, the pews were nearly full. Daniel guided them toward a row near the back. An older woman in the next pew, gray hair pulled tight, thin lips, sharp eyes turned and stared openly. The service began. Hymns rose toward the rafters. Scripture readings echoed off the walls. The pastor's voice washed over Margaret without meaning. She was too aware of the eyes on her back, the weight of judgment pressing against her shoulders. After the service, they filed outside. The sun hung high now, warm against her face. Daniel stopped to speak with another rancher about cattle prices. The boys stood beside him, small statues in miniature suits. The gray-haired woman approached. Ruth Hawkins. Margaret had learned her name. Her husband trailed behind her, hat in his hands, eyes on the ground. Daniel. Her voice carried across the churchyard. Who's this woman you've got staying with you? Daniel straightened. Mrs. Hawkins, this is Miss Margaret Weaver. She's helping with the boys. Helping? Ruth's eyes swept over Margaret from head to hem. Is that what they're calling it these days? Margaret's hands curled at her sides. She forced them open. "Ma'am?" she said, her voice steady. "I sleep in the guest room. I cook meals and look after the children. That's all." The guest room. Ruth's eyebrows rose. "How convenient. The nearest boarding house is 3 miles into town, I suppose." "That's right," Daniel cut in. "Too far to walk twice a day." Ruth made a sound in her throat. That single syllable carried the weight of every unspoken accusation, every whispered judgment, every raised eyebrow Margaret had felt since walking into this church. "Come along, Harold." Ruth turned away. "Service is over." They walked off. Other families followed, glancing back over their shoulders, some curious, some darker. On the wagon ride home, no one spoke. The boys sat in the back, their church clothes already wrinkling. The road stretched out before them, dusty and empty. "Maybe I should go back to sleeping in the barn," Margaret said finally. "Folks are talking. Folks always talk. It could hurt you. Hurt the boys." Daniel's hands tightened on the reins. The leather creaked. "You're sleeping in the house," he said. "That's final." They didn't speak again until they reached the ranch. That evening, after the boys were in bed, Daniel and Margaret sat on the porch. The stars emerged slowly, scattered across the black sky like spilled salt. "You got family waiting for you in California?" Daniel asked. Margaret's hands lay still in her lap. The question hung between them, heavy with everything it didn't say. "Nobody's waiting for me nowhere. Mr. Carter?" He didn't ask more. She didn't explain. The next morning, the letter arrived. Daniel's hands shook as he held the letter. Margaret stood by the stove, a wooden spoon frozen in her hand, watching him. The paper crinkled under his grip, edges folding inward. The color drained from his face, leaving his skin pale as ash. The boys sat at the table, spoons hovering over their oatmeal. Ethan's gaze shifted between his father and Margaret. Elijah clutched the wooden horse beneath the table, his knuckles white. Daniel walked to the window. His boots struck the floorboards heavy and slow. He stopped with his back to the room, the letter still clenched in his fist. "Boys," Margaret said quietly, "finish your breakfast and go outside. Check on the chickens for me." They didn't move. "Go on now." Ethan stood first. He took his brother's hand and led him toward the door. The screen banged shut behind them, and their footsteps faded across the porch. Margaret set down the spoon, wiped her hands on her apron, walked slowly toward Daniel. "What is it?" His shoulders rose and fell with each breath. The morning light through the window caught the stubble on his jaw, the deep lines around his eyes that hadn't been there 5 weeks ago. "Her brother," his voice came out flat, scraped raw. "He wants the boys." Margaret's stomach dropped. "Sarah's brother," Daniel continued. "Cornelius Harmon. Owns a general store in Denver. Big man. Got lawyers. Got money." He turned to face her, and his eyes were red-rimmed, desperate. "Got everything I don't." "On what grounds?" Daniel laughed, a harsh, broken sound that had nothing to do with humor. He thrust the letter toward her. "Read it yourself." Margaret took the paper. The handwriting was elegant, slanted, clearly written by someone educated. A lawyer, most likely. She scanned the lines. "Concerns regarding the welfare of our nephews. Ethan and Elijah Carter. Reports of an unsuitable domestic arrangement. An unmarried woman of unknown character residing in the household. Request a formal hearing to discuss guardianship. Her hands trembled. She lowered the letter. "He's using me," she said. "Using the fact that I'm here." "He's using whatever he can get." Daniel grabbed the letter back, crumpled it into a ball, and hurled it at the wall. It bounced off and rolled across the floor. He never visited, not once, not when Sarah was alive, not when she was sick, not when she was dying in that bed right there. He pointed toward the back of the house. "I sent word. I begged him to come see her before the end. He didn't even write back." "Then why now?" Daniel's jaw tightened. He walked to the table, gripped the back of a chair, and leaned into it like a man trying not to fall. "The land," he said. 200 acres. Sarah's inheritance from her daddy. Goes to the boys when they turn 21. He looked up at her. "But if Cornelius gets custody, he manages it till then, sells it if he wants, keeps the money." Margaret felt the floor shift beneath her feet. She reached for the counter, steadied herself. "I can leave?" she said. "If I'm the problem, if me being here is what gives him—" "No." "Daniel, listen to me." "I said no." He straightened, his hands falling to his sides. "You ain't the problem. You're the only thing keeping this house standing." He stepped toward her, close enough that she could see the pulse jumping in his throat. "Those boys, they're changing. Ethan asked for more pie. Elijah put that horse in your lap. That ain't nothing. That's everything." Margaret's throat closed. She couldn't speak. "You stay," Daniel said. "We figure this out together." The afternoon brought no peace. Margaret went into town for flour, her mind churning with the letter's words. The wagon rattled over the familiar ruts, but everything looked different now. Sharper, more dangerous. She tied the horse outside the general store and stepped inside. The smell of coffee beans and tobacco wrapped around her. Old Mr. Hendricks stood behind the counter, his spectacles perched on his nose. "Afternoon, Miss Weaver." "Mr. Hendricks." She moved through the store, gathering what she needed: flour, salt, a small bag of sugar. Her hands moved automatically while her mind stayed locked on the letter. The door opened behind her. Boot heels clicked on the wooden floor, expensive boots. From the sound of them, not farmer's boots. Margaret didn't turn around, but she watched in the dusty mirror behind the counter. A man stood near the entrance, tall, dark vest buttoned over a white shirt, gold watch chain glinting in the light. His hair was slicked back, his face clean-shaven, his posture the posture of a man who expected the world to arrange itself around him. He approached the counter. Mr. Hendricks looked up. "Help you, sir?" "I'm looking for the Carter Ranch. Daniel Carter. You know him?" Mr. Hendricks's eyes flickered to Margaret, then back to the stranger. Who's asking? Family." The man smiled thin, practiced. "His late wife was my sister." Margaret's hands tightened on the flour bag. She kept her head down, her face turned away. "The Carter place is about 3 miles north," Mr. Hendricks said slowly. "Follow the main road. Take the fork left at the old oak. Can't miss it. Much obliged." The boots clicked toward the door. Paused. "I heard there's a woman staying with him now." That true silence. Just curious, the man said. Family worries about these things. The door opened and closed. Margaret didn't move until the sound of hoofbeats faded into the distance. Mr. Hendricks cleared his throat. You all right, Miss Weaver? She nodded, paid for her goods, walked out to the wagon on legs that felt like they belonged to someone else. She drove home faster than she had ever driven before. The wagon bounced over ruts in the road. Dust rose behind her in thick clouds. By the time she reached the ranch, sweat soaked through the back of her dress. Daniel was in the field, mending fence. She ran toward him, the flour forgotten in the wagon. Daniel. He looked up, saw her face, dropped the hammer. What happened? He's here. She stopped in front of him, breathing hard. Cornelius, I saw him in town. At Hendricks's store. He was asking about you. About the ranch. She swallowed. About me. Daniel's face went still. The wind caught his hair, pushed it across his forehead. He didn't move to brush it away. Did he see you? I don't think so. I kept my back turned. He nodded slowly. His eyes moved past her, toward the horizon, toward something she couldn't see. It's starting, he said quietly. Margaret grabbed his arm. Daniel, we have to do something. We have to... What? He looked at her. What do we do? He's got lawyers. He's got money. He's got the whole territory believing I'm some fool who can't raise his own children. His voice cracked. What am I supposed to do? She had no answer. Nothing that made sense. Nothing that would fix this. They stood in the field, the sun beating down on their shoulders, the wind carrying the smell of dry grass and dust. Behind them, the boys were somewhere she could hear Elijah's bare feet on the porch boards, hear Ethan calling for him to come see something. Normal sounds, everyday sounds, the sounds of a family she had somehow become part of, and somewhere in town. Cornelius Harmon was already planning his next move. That night, after the boys were asleep, Daniel sat at the kitchen table with his head in his hands. Margaret sat across from him, the lamp burning low between them. The hearing's in 3 weeks, he said. That's what the letter said. 3 weeks to prove I'm fit to raise my own sons. Then we prove it. He looked up. How? Margaret's hands lay flat on the table. She looked at them roughened from work, nails short, a small scar across her left thumb from a knife that slipped years ago. I don't know yet, she said, but I ain't leaving, and I ain't letting him take those boys. Daniel stared at her across the lamplight. Why? He asked. Why do you care so much? You could walk away, get on that train to California. Forget all of this. Margaret didn't answer right away. The wind scratched at the windows. The lamp hissed and sputtered. Because, she said finally, I already tried running once. It didn't work. She stood, walked to the door, stopped with her hand on the frame. Good night, Daniel. Margaret. She turned. His eyes held hers across the dim room. Thank you, he said. She nodded and walked into the darkness of the hallway. But sleep wouldn't come. She lay in her bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the house settle around her. 3 weeks. They had 3 weeks, and Cornelius Harmon was already in town. The sky turned black at 3 in the afternoon. Margaret stood at the kitchen window, watching the clouds roll in from the west. They moved fast, too fast, swallowing the blue sky like ink spreading through water. The air had changed. Heavy. Electric. The hair on her arms stood up. Daniel had ridden out to the far pasture that morning to check on the cattle. He wouldn't be back for hours. "Boys," she called. "Come inside." Ethan appeared in the doorway first, his shirt dusty from playing near the barn. Elijah followed. The wooden horse clutched against his chest. "Storm's coming," Margaret said. "Help me close the shutters." They moved through the house together. Margaret lifted the heavy wooden panels while Ethan pushed the latches into place. The wind picked up outside, rattling the glass, whistling through cracks in the walls she hadn't noticed before. The first thunder rolled across the valley. Elijah froze. His whole body went rigid, his fingers tightening around the horse until his knuckles turned white. Margaret knelt beside him. "It's just thunder, sweetheart. Just noise." But the boy's eyes had gone wide, unfocused. He wasn't looking at her. He was somewhere else, somewhere inside his own memory, his own fear. Lightning split the sky. The thunder that followed shook the floorboards beneath their feet. Elijah bolted. He ran for the door, yanked it open, and disappeared into the howling wind before Margaret could grab him. "Elijah." She ran after him. The wind hit her like a wall, tearing at her hair, her dress. Rain hadn't started yet, but the air smelled of it, wet earth, something sharp and electric that burned in her nostrils. Elijah ran toward the barn. His small legs pumped beneath him, bare feet slapping the dirt. Margaret's boots pounded after him, her lungs burning with each breath. She caught up to him just as he reached the barn door. Her hand closed around his arm, and she pulled him inside. The barn was dark. The wind screamed through gaps in the wooden slats, making the whole structure groan and creak. The horses stamped and whinnied in their stalls, their eyes rolling white with fear. Lightning flashed again. In that brief moment of illumination, Margaret saw Elijah's face, tears streaming down his cheeks, his mouth open, his whole body shaking. Thunder crashed. The sound was massive, deafening, like the sky itself was breaking apart. The boy's legs gave out. Margaret caught him before he hit the ground. She pulled him close, wrapping her arms around his shaking body. He was so small, so light, like holding a bundle of sticks and fear and something desperately trying not to shatter. "Shh," she whispered. "Shh, I've got you. I've got you." Ethan appeared in the doorway, soaking wet. The rain had started sheets of it, pounding the roof like 1,000 drummers. He ran to his brother's side, grabbed his hand, and held on. The three of them huddled in the corner of the barn, away from the horses, away from the doors that rattled with each gust of wind. Margaret pulled them both close. The boys pressed against her, their bodies trembling with each crack of thunder. She remembered something. A lantern, hanging on a hook by the door. She reached for it, fumbling with the matches in her pocket. Her hands shook. The first match broke against the striker. The second one caught, and she touched the flame to the wick. Warm light filled the corner of the barn. The shadows retreated. Another flash. Another boom. Elijah buried his face in Margaret's shoulder, his fingers digging into her arm hard enough to bruise. "Your mama," Margaret said softly, her lips close to his ear. "She used to hold you during storms. Didn't she?" The boy went still against her. His breathing hitched. "I ain't her," Margaret continued. "I know that, but I'm here, and I ain't going nowhere." The storm raged outside. Rain hammered the roof. Wind shrieked through every crack and gap in the old wood, but inside their small circle of lantern light, something shifted. Something changed. Elijah's grip loosened. His breathing slowed. His face turned just slightly, so that his cheek rested against Margaret's shoulder instead of hiding from the world. Lightning flashed so bright it turned everything white for a moment. Thunder rolled, long and low, shaking the barn to its foundations. And Elijah spoke. "Mama." The word came out broken, barely a whisper. Margaret's heart stopped. Her arms tightened around him. The boy pulled back, looked up at her with those dark, wounded eyes. Something flickered across his face, confusion, recognition, something raw and desperate. "Miss," he swallowed. "Miss Margaret." Tears spilled down Margaret's cheeks. She couldn't stop them, didn't try. "That's right," she whispered. "I'm here." Ethan was crying two silent tears that dripped from his chin onto his brother's shoulder. He didn't let go of Elijah's hand. The storm began to fade. The thunder grew distant, rolling away toward the mountains. The rain softened from a roar to a steady patter to a gentle tapping on the roof. Hoofbeats pounded through the mud outside. "Margaret, boys!" Daniel's voice, raw with panic. The barn door flew open, and he stood there soaking wet, mud splattered up to his knees, his hat gone, his hair plastered to his forehead. He saw them, huddled in the corner, the lantern glowing, 3 faces turned toward him in the dim light. He crossed the barn in 3 strides and dropped to his knees beside them. "Are you hurt? Is everyone—" "We're fine," Margaret said. Her voice came out strange, thick with tears. "We're all fine." Daniel's eyes moved from her face to Ethan's, then to Elijah's. The smaller boy still leaned against Margaret. The wooden horse pressed between them. "He spoke," Margaret whispered. Daniel's whole body went still. "What, Elijah?" "He spoke. Just now." Daniel's hand reached out, trembling, and touched his son's cheek. Elijah looked at him, really looked. Not through him, not past him. "Pa," the boy said. Daniel made a sound something between a laugh and a sob. He pulled Elijah into his arms and held him tight enough to break. Ethan pressed himself against his father's side. And Daniel pulled him in too. The 4 of them stayed like that as the last of the storm faded. The rain stopped. The clouds began to break apart, letting through streaks of golden evening light. When they finally walked back to the house, the world smelled new, wet earth, clean air, grass and mud and something fresh. Puddles dotted the yard. The setting sun turned them into mirrors of orange and gold. Margaret stopped on the porch. She had changed into dry clothes while Daniel put the boys to bed, their voices drifting back through the cabin. Small and tired, but present. Real. Daniel appeared beside her. He had changed too, though his hair was still damp. "He called you Mama," he said quietly. Margaret didn't look at him. He corrected himself. "Don't matter." Daniel stepped closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him through the evening air. "First word he said in near a year, and he said it to you." The sun sank lower. The sky turned from gold to pink to deep purple. "Sarah?" Daniel said. "She would have liked you, I think." Margaret's throat tightened. "Don't know about that. Mr. Carter." "Daniel." She finally turned to look at him. His face was half in shadow, half in fading light. "Daniel," she said. They stood in silence as the stars began to emerge, one by one, then dozens, then hundreds. "I ain't leaving," Margaret said. Her voice was steady now, certain. "Not in 3 months. Not ever. Unless you tell me to go." Daniel looked at her for a long moment. The crickets began their evening song somewhere in the house. Ethan laughed a real laugh, the sound of a child who had remembered how. "Then stay," Daniel said. She nodded. They walked inside together, into the warm light of the kitchen, where 2 boys sat at the table asking for supper. But across town, in a room at the hotel, Cornelius Harmon sat at a desk writing a letter to his lawyer in Denver. The hearing was in 2 weeks. The courtroom smelled of sweat and old wood and something sour that might have been fear. Daniel sat on a hard bench near the front, his best shirt already damp under the arms. He had shaved that morning, nicked himself twice on the jaw, and pressed his trousers with a hot iron. But looking around the room at the polished boots and tailored vests and gold watch chains, he felt like a scarecrow dressed up for Sunday. The judge sat behind a raised oak desk, a heavy man with white whiskers and spectacles perched on the end of his nose. To Daniel's left, Cornelius Harmon occupied a chair beside a man in a black suit, the lawyer from Denver, with slicked back hair and a leather briefcase that probably cost more than Daniel's best cattle. The gallery behind them was packed. Farmers in clean overalls, women in bonnets, whispering behind gloved hands. Ruth Hawkins sat in the second row, her thin lips pressed together, her eyes fixed on Daniel. The judge rapped his gavel. "This hearing will come to order. We are here to consider the petition filed by Mr. Cornelius Harmon of Denver, seeking guardianship of the minor children Ethan and Elijah Carter." He peered over his spectacles at Daniel. "Mr. Carter, you are representing yourself." Daniel stood. His legs felt unsteady. "Yes, Your Honor." A murmur rippled through the gallery. The Denver lawyer smiled. "Very well. Mr. Whitfield, you may proceed." The lawyer rose. He moved like a man who had done this 100 times, confident and unhurried. He buttoned his jacket with one hand as he approached the center of the room. "Your Honor, my client's concerns are simple. His sister, Mrs. Sarah Carter, God rest her soul, passed away nearly 1 year ago, leaving behind 2 young boys and a grieving husband." He paused, letting the words settle. "In the months since, Mr. Daniel Carter has demonstrated a troubling pattern of behavior that calls into question his fitness as a parent." Daniel's hands curled into fists on his knees. "First, Mr. Carter works in the fields from dawn until dusk, leaving his children unsupervised for the majority of each day. Second, and more concerning, he has taken into his home a woman of unknown origin, a stranger he met at a train station, and installed her in his household without any formal arrangement or propriety. The whispers grew louder. Daniel felt the eyes on him, crawling over his skin. "We have testimony," Whitfield continued, "from multiple residents of this community, confirming that this woman, Miss Margaret Weaver, has been seen entering and exiting Mr. Carter's home at all hours. The nature of their relationship remains unclear." Someone in the gallery snickered. Daniel's face burned. "Your Honor, my client seeks only to protect his nephews from an unsuitable environment. He is prepared to provide them with a stable home, proper schooling, and the care they deserve." Whitfield returned to his seat. Cornelius patted his arm. The judge turned to Daniel. "Mr. Carter, you may respond." Daniel stood again. His throat had gone dry. He looked at the judge, at the lawyer, at the sea of faces behind him, and the words he had practiced that morning vanished. "I work hard, Your Honor." "That's true. A man's got to work to feed his family." "And during that time," Whitfield interrupted, "who supervises your children?" "Miss Margaret, a woman you met at a train station." The lawyer's voice dripped with contempt. "A stranger with no references, no family connections, no verifiable history." "She ain't a stranger no more." Daniel's voice came out too loud, too defensive. "She's been with us 8 weeks. The boys trust her. They trust her." Whitfield stood again, approaching Daniel. "Mr. Carter, when was the last time your sons spoke before this woman arrived?" Daniel's mouth opened, closed. "Answer the question." "Mr. Carter." "They didn't talk, not since their mama passed. And now they talk, both of them. Elijah spoke for the first time just last week. Said, 'How convenient.'" Whitfield turned to the judge. "Your Honor, we have a man who admits his children were so traumatized they stopped speaking, and his solution was to bring a strange woman into his home." The gallery erupted in whispers. The judge rapped his gavel. "Order!" Daniel's legs trembled. The sweat ran down his back, soaking through his shirt. He looked at Cornelius, saw the satisfaction in his brother-in-law's eyes, and something inside him cracked. "You don't care about those boys?" he said, his voice shaking. "You never visited when Sarah was alive? Never sent a letter? Never—" "Mr. Carter," the judge's voice cut through, "you will address your remarks to the bench." Daniel's face burned hotter. He had made a mistake. He could see it in every face: the judge, the lawyer, Ruth Hawkins nodding as if he had confirmed everything she believed. "I apologize, Your Honor. The judge removed his spectacles and rubbed his eyes. "Mr. Carter, I have one question. Think carefully before you answer." He leaned forward. "If something were to happen to you, God forbid, who would raise these boys? Do you have family? A wife, anyone who could step in?" The room went silent. Daniel's mind raced. Family. He had none, not here, not anywhere. His parents were dead. His brothers scattered years ago. And a wife? He opened his mouth. Nothing came out. The silence stretched. 1 second. 2. 3. Cornelius Harmon leaned back, his lips curling into a smile. "I thought as much," the judge said quietly. He made a note on the paper before him. "This court will recess for 2 weeks to allow both parties to prepare final arguments. A decision will be rendered at that time." The gavel fell. People rose. Voices filled the room. Daniel stood frozen. Whitfield walked past him, close enough to whisper, Better start packing their things. Mr. Carter. Daniel walked home alone. The road stretched before him, dusty and endless. His boots dragged through the dirt. The sun hung low, casting his shadow long and thin across the ground. He had stood there like a fool. Couldn't answer a simple question. Couldn't defend himself. Couldn't do anything but stammer while that lawyer picked him apart in front of the whole town. The house appeared on the horizon small, weathered, the lamp already lit in the kitchen window. He could see figures moving inside. Margaret. The boys. His boys. For now. He stopped at the gate. Couldn't make himself go in. Couldn't face them. Couldn't look into their eyes and pretend everything would be all right. His boots slipped on the wet ground mud from yesterday's storm, still thick and black near the fence post. He stumbled, caught himself on the rail. His hand slipped. He went down. His knees hit the mud first, then his palms. Cold. Wet. The smell of earth and manure filled his nostrils. Black muck oozed between his fingers, soaking through his good trousers. The ones he had pressed that morning. He didn't get up. This was where he belonged. In the mud. In the dirt. A man who couldn't answer one question. A man who couldn't protect his own children. Footsteps approached. Light. Careful. Daniel. Margaret's voice. Soft. Concerned. He couldn't look at her. Couldn't let her see him like this on his knees in the filth, shaking, broken. He asked who would raise them. Daniel said, his voice barely a whisper. If something happened to me, and I couldn't, I didn't. Margaret knelt beside him. Her dress dragged through the mud, but she didn't seem to notice. Her hand found his shoulder. Daniel, look at me. He couldn't. Daniel. Slowly, he raised his head. Her face was inches from his dirt already on her hem, strands of hair loose around her face, eyes steady and fierce. You ain't gonna lose them, she said. You don't know that. No, I don't. Her grip tightened. But I ain't gonna let it happen without a fight. Behind them, the screen door creaked. Small footsteps on the porch. Pa, Ethan's voice. Then Elijah's, smaller. Pa, you okay? Daniel looked at his sons, standing on the porch, silhouettes against the lamplight, watching their father kneeling in the mud, and in that moment, covered in filth, stripped of every scrap of dignity. Daniel made a decision. He would not let Cornelius take them. He would fight with everything he had, even if everything he had wasn't enough. But there was only one way to win. The morning of the final hearing arrived under a sky the color of bruised peaches. Margaret stood before the mirror in the small room that had become hers. The dress hung on a hook beside her pale blue calico with white lace at the collar. Sarah's dress. Daniel had pulled it from a trunk 2 nights ago and laid it across the foot of her bed without a word. She had tried to refuse. Had said she couldn't wear a dead woman's clothes to a courtroom. Daniel had looked at her with those tired eyes and said, she'd want you to. She'd want someone fighting for her boys. Margaret's fingers trembled as she lifted the dress from the hook. The fabric smelled of cedar and something faintly floral lavender. Maybe. Tucked into the folds years ago and never quite fading. She slipped it over her head, fastened the buttons at her wrists, and smoothed the skirt over her hips. It fit, almost perfectly. She pinned her hair up with a simple wooden clasp. No ribbons, no jewelry, just clean lines and steady hands. When she walked into the kitchen, Daniel was already dressed, his jaw freshly shaved, his hair combed back with water, but his eyes were hollow, rimmed with red. He hadn't slept. Neither had she. They had talked the night before, sat on the porch until the stars wheeled overhead, speaking in low voices about what was coming, about what might happen, about the one thing that could change everything. The boys sat at the table, picking at their oatmeal. Ethan's spoon scraped the bottom of his bowl. Elijah held his wooden horse in one hand, the other resting flat on the table. "You look nice," Daniel said. His voice came out rough. "So do you." They stood there, the length of the kitchen between them. Outside, a rooster crowed. "Daniel." He looked at her. "There's one way to end this. For good." His brow furrowed. "We talked about this. I know what we talked about." Margaret crossed the room, stopped in front of him, close enough to see the pulse jumping in his throat. "If I ain't a stranger, if I'm family." He's got no case. "Margaret, I can't ask you to." "You ain't asking." She held his gaze. "I'm telling you, those boys need someone who stays. And I already—" She stopped, swallowed. "I'd fight for them, same as if they were my own." Daniel's hands hung at his sides. His chest rose and fell with each breath. "You'd do that for them, for all of you." The courtroom was fuller than before. Every bench packed, people standing along the walls, pressing close to hear. The air hung thick and stale. Too many bodies. Not enough windows. Daniel sat beside Margaret this time. His hand found hers under the table and gripped tight. The judge entered. Everyone rose. The gavel fell. "This hearing will resume. Mr. Whitfield, do you have any additional evidence to present?" The Denver lawyer stood, buttoning his jacket. "Your Honor, I believe our case speaks for itself. Mr. Carter has demonstrated a pattern of poor judgment that—" "Your Honor?" Margaret's voice cut through the room. Every head turned. The judge peered at her over his spectacles. "And you are—" "Margaret Weaver. I've been living with the Carter family for the past 10 weeks. Whispers erupted. Ruth Hawkins leaned forward in her seat. Whitfield stepped forward. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. Miss Weaver is not a party to these proceedings. She lives in the household in question." The judge studied Margaret for a long moment. "Mr. Carter, do you wish to call Miss Weaver as a witness?" Daniel stood. "Yes, Your Honor." "I do." The judge nodded. "Very well, Miss Weaver, approach the bench." Margaret released Daniel's hand. She walked to the center of the room, her boots echoing on the wooden floor. The faces watching her blurred together: farmers, merchants, housewives, strangers. She focused on the judge. "State your name for the record. Margaret Ann Weaver." "Margaret Ann." "And your relationship to the Carter family?" Margaret's hands were steady at her sides. "I came to this household 10 weeks ago to help care for the children. I cook. I clean. I look after Ethan and Elijah while their father works." "And where do you sleep, Miss Weaver?" "In the guest room, alone." A murmur rippled through the gallery. "Miss Weaver, you may speak to the matter at hand." Margaret took a breath. "I came here looking to run away from my own ghosts. My husband died 14 months ago. I sold everything we owned and bought a ticket to California. Figured I'd start over somewhere new. The room was silent now. I got off the train in Ridgewood because I needed water. That's all. Mr. Carter found me on the platform. He didn't ask about my history, didn't ask where I came from. He just said his boys needed help and asked if I'd give it. She turned slightly, enough to see Daniel. His face was pale, his hands clasped tight in his lap. Those boys didn't talk when I arrived, not a word. They'd been silent for near a year, locked up in their own grief. Her voice wavered. She steadied it. But they ain't silent no more. Elijah spoke his first word during a thunderstorm, hiding in the barn with me. A woman in the gallery made a soft sound. I ain't their mama. Never will be. But I'll be there. Every morning. Every night. Long as they need me. She turned to face Cornelius Harmon directly. The man sat rigid in his chair, his face a careful mask. Mr. Harmon, you say you care about your nephews. When's the last time you wrote them a letter, sent a birthday gift, visited when their mama was sick? Cornelius's jaw tightened. He didn't answer. I thought so. Margaret turned back to the judge. Your Honor, I got no fancy words. I ain't educated. But I know one thing, those boys don't need a rich uncle in Denver who never bothered to learn their names. They need someone who stays. She walked back to her seat. Daniel's hand found hers again, being squeezing tight. The judge removed his spectacles, rubbed his eyes, replaced them. This ain't strictly procedure, he said slowly. But I'd like to hear from the children themselves. Mr. Carter, would you bring your sons forward? Daniel stood. His legs moved mechanically as he walked to the back of the courtroom, where Ethan and Elijah sat with Mrs. Henderson from the neighboring ranch. He knelt before them, spoke softly, and led them by the hand to the front of the room. The boys stood before the judge's bench, small and solemn in their Sunday clothes. Ethan's chin was raised. Elijah clutched his wooden horse against his chest. Boys, the judge said, his voice gentler now. I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly. Can you do that? Ethan nodded. Where do you want to live? Ethan glanced at his brother. Something passed between them, a language only twins could speak. With Pa, Ethan said. And Miss Margaret? The judge nodded. And why is that? She taught me to make pie. Mama's recipe. She didn't try to be Mama. She just... He paused, searching for words. She just stayed. The judge turned to Elijah. And you? Son, where do you want to live? The room fell silent. Every breath held. Every eye fixed on the small boy with the wooden horse. Elijah didn't answer. He stepped away from the bench, walked across the courtroom floor, his bare feet patting softly on the wood, his small shadow stretching behind him, stopped between Daniel and Margaret, and took both their hands. Home, he said. His voice was small but clear. I want to go home. Daniel's knees buckled. He dropped to the floor and pulled both boys into his arms, his shoulders shaking. Margaret knelt beside him, her hand on his back, tears streaming down her face. The judge rapped his gavel. This court will take a brief recess. Cornelius Harmon rose from his chair. His lawyer whispered something, but Cornelius shook his head. He walked toward the door, paused at the threshold. His face had gone pale, his jaw slack. For a moment, something flickered in his eyes. Not anger, not defeat, something older, something that looked almost like shame. Then he pushed through the door and was gone. When the court reconvened, Cornelius Harmon's chair was empty. His lawyer stood alone, looking lost without his client. "Your Honor," Whitfield said, "my client has withdrawn his petition." The gallery erupted. The gavel fell again and again. "Order, order in this court." The noise subsided. The judge turned his attention to the front of the room. "Given the petitioner's withdrawal, I see no grounds to continue these proceedings." He looked at Daniel, at Margaret, at the two boys still holding their hands. "Case dismissed. These children will remain in the custody of their father." Daniel made a sound something between a sob and a prayer. The judge set down his gavel. For a moment, the stern lines of his face softened. "And Mr. Carter," Daniel looked up. "I suggest you make an honest woman of Miss Weaver before the town gossips have anything else to talk about." Laughter rippled through the gallery, warm, relieved. Margaret felt Daniel's hand tighten around hers. She didn't pull away. Outside, in the afternoon sun, Cornelius Harmon climbed into his rented carriage. He didn't look back at the courthouse, didn't look at the town that had watched him lose. He simply picked up the reins and drove away. Word came later that he had checked out of the hotel that same afternoon, left a letter for his lawyer, headed back to Denver on the evening stage. Nobody heard from him again. The church stood white against the autumn sky, its steeple catching the afternoon light. 1 week had passed since the hearing. 1 week of quiet mornings and long evenings, of meals shared around the kitchen table, of Ethan's voice growing stronger and Elijah's laughter returning in small, unexpected bursts. Margaret stood in the small room behind the sanctuary, her hands smoothing the fabric of her dress. White cotton, simple cut, altered from one of Sarah's old Sunday dresses. The seams had been let out at the waist, taken in at the shoulders. It fit now. A knock at the door. "Come in." Ruth Hawkins entered. Her sharp features had softened since the courtroom, since she had watched 2 small boys choose the woman she had whispered about for weeks. She carried a small bouquet of wildflowers, yellow daisies, purple asters, sprigs of lavender tied with a white ribbon. "Picked these from the meadow this morning," Ruth said. She held them out, her eyes not quite meeting Margaret's. "Figured you might need something to hold." Margaret took the flowers. The stems were still cool from morning dew. "Thank you, Mrs. Hawkins." Ruth stood there, hands clasped before her. The silence stretched. "I was wrong about you," she said finally. "Said things I shouldn't have. Thought things I'm ashamed of now." She lifted her chin. "You're good for them. For Daniel and those boys. I see that now." Margaret's throat tightened. She nodded. Ruth turned to leave, then paused at the door. "Sarah would have liked you. I knew her since she was a girl. She had a way of seeing people really seeing them, past all the mess and mistakes." A faint smile crossed her weathered face. "She would have seen you true." Then she was gone. Margaret stood alone, the wildflowers trembling in her hands. The sanctuary was small, 6 rows of wooden pews, a simple altar. Afternoon light streaming through plain glass windows. No stained glass here. No organ. Just honest wood and honest light. Daniel waited at the front, his back straight, his hands clasped before him. He wore his best suit, the same one he had worn to Sarah's funeral, though Margaret didn't know that. His hair was combed back, still damp, his boots polished until they shone. Beside him stood Pastor Thompson, A thin man with kind eyes and a Bible worn soft from decades of use. And in the front pew sat Ethan and Elijah, their legs swinging above the floor, their faces scrubbed clean. The door at the back of the church opened. Margaret walked forward. No music, no procession, just her boots on the wooden floor, the rustle of her dress. The wildflowers clutched against her chest. Daniel turned. His eyes found hers across the length of the room. She reached the altar, stood beside him. Pastor Thompson opened his Bible. Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today to join this man and this woman in holy matrimony. The words washed over her, ancient words, sacred words. Margaret heard them and didn't hear them. Her attention split between the man beside her and the two boys in the front pew. Elijah had brought his wooden horse. It rested on his lap, his small fingers tracing the carved mane as the pastor spoke. Do you, Daniel James Carter, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife? I do. His voice was steady, certain. And do you, Margaret Ann Weaver, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband? She looked at Daniel, at the lines around his eyes, the calluses on his hands, the way he stood like a man who had learned to carry heavy things alone. I do, Pastor Thompson smiled. Then by the power vested in me, I pronounce you husband and wife. Daniel turned to her, his hand rough, warm, trembling slightly found her cheek. He kissed her. It was not a passionate kiss, not the kiss of young lovers. It was something quieter, a promise, a beginning. When they turned to face the pews, Ethan was grinning. Elijah slid off the bench and ran forward, wrapping his arms around Margaret's legs. Does this mean you're staying forever? He asked, his voice muffled against her dress. Margaret knelt down, the white fabric pooling on the wooden floor. Forever, she said. The evening settled over the ranch like a blanket pulled up to the chin. Supper had been simple roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans from the garden. But the table had been full of sound. Ethan talking about the book. Margaret had been reading to them. Elijah asking questions about everything. His voice still scratchy but growing stronger each day. Now the dishes were washed, the kitchen cleaned, the boys tucked into bed. Margaret stood in their doorway, watching them sleep. Ethan lay on his back, one arm flung over his head, Elijah curled on his side, the wooden horse resting beside his pillow. She had told them a story before bed, not from a book from her own life, about Kansas, about the wheat fields, about Thomas, her first husband, and the way he used to whistle while he worked. It was the first time she had spoken his name aloud in months, the first time the memory hadn't cut like broken glass. They asleep. Daniel's voice, soft behind her. Finally, she closed the door gently and walked with him through the darkened house. The lamp in the kitchen had been extinguished. Only moonlight guided them now, silver pools on the wooden floor, pale rectangles where it fell through windows. They stepped onto the porch. The rocking chair sat where it had always sat, Sarah's chair. Untouched for nearly a year. Margaret had cleaned it that afternoon, wiped away the dust and cobwebs, oiled the runners until they moved smooth and silent. She stopped before it. Daniel stood beside her. I wasn't sure if you'd mind, she said. I don't mind. She lowered herself into the chair. The wood creaked beneath her weight, settling into its old rhythm. She pressed her feet against the porch boards and set it rocking slow, gentle. Daniel leaned against the post, his arms crossed, his eyes on the horizon. The sun had set an hour ago, but the sky still held a faint glow, purple fading to black, stars emerging one by one. The mountains stood as dark shapes against the darkness. "You ever think about California anymore?" Daniel asked. Margaret considered the question. Turned it over like a stone worn smooth by water. "What's in California?" "I don't know. You never told me?" "Nothing?" She rocked the chair slowly. "Nothing at all?" The crickets sang. A coyote called in the distance. Another answered. The screen door creaked behind them. Elijah stood there, barefoot, the wooden horse dangling from one hand. His eyes were wide not with fear, but with something else. "I had a dream," he said. Margaret held out her hand. "Come here, sweetheart." He crossed the porch and climbed into her lap. The rocking chair accepted his weight, settling lower, its rhythm unchanged. Daniel moved to sit on the step nearby, his back against the post. "What did you dream about?" Margaret asked. Elijah was quiet. His fingers traced the mane of the wooden horse. "Mama," he said. "My real mama. She was standing in a field, like the one behind the barn, and she was smiling." Margaret's chest tightened. She waited. "Do you think she can see us?" He looked up at her, his dark eyes searching. From heaven. The question hung in the air. Margaret looked up at the sky, at the thousands of stars, at the great river of light stretching across the darkness. "I think she's watching right now," she said softly. "And I think she's smiling." Elijah nodded. He settled deeper into her lap, his head resting against her shoulder. "I think so too." The screen door creaked again. Ethan appeared, rubbing his eyes. "Eli's gone," he said. Then he saw his brother. "Oh, come sit with us," Daniel said. Ethan crossed the porch and settled beside his father. Daniel's arm came around him, pulling him close. The four of them sat in silence as the night deepened. The rocking chair moved in its gentle rhythm. The stars wheeled overhead. Margaret looked at Daniel across the darkness. He didn't speak. Didn't need to. Some things didn't require words. Elijah's breathing slowed against her shoulder. Asleep again. His small body warm and trusting. Ethan's eyes were closed too, his head resting against his father's arm. Daniel caught her gaze. In the moonlight, she could see the faint curve of his lips. Not quite a smile. Something softer. Something that had been waiting a long time to surface. She rocked the chair. Back and forth. Back and forth. The wind stirred the grass in the yard. The lamp flickered through the window behind them. Somewhere in the night, in the space between the stars, something old was ending and something new was beginning. Margaret closed her eyes. She had come here looking to run away, had found instead a broken house, two silent boys, and a man who had forgotten how to hope. Now the house was full of sound. The boys were talking again. And the man was her husband. She opened her eyes, looked out at the land stretching away into darkness. The land that was now her home. The rocking chair creaked softly. The stars burned on. And somewhere far away, a train whistle sounded, carrying someone else toward whatever waited at the end of their journey. Margaret didn't look up. She was already home. There is something quiet that stays with us after a story like this one. Something tender, maybe a little heavy in the chest. It does not ask to be named or explained. It simply sits there for a while, The way old memories do when they surface without warning? Many of us have stood at crossroads we never expected. Some of us have found ourselves in kitchens that belonged to someone else, learning to fill spaces we never imagined we would occupy. Perhaps you have known what it means to love children who did not come from you, or to rebuild something from the pieces another person left behind. Perhaps you have been the one who stayed when staying was the harder choice. These things do not need to be resolved tonight. They are allowed to rest exactly where they are unfinished. Imperfect, still tender to the touch. Not every wound closes neatly. Not every question finds its answer. And that is all right. We carry what we carry. We love who we love. Sometimes that is enough. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening all the way through.